I will never forget the night I discovered the truth. It began like so many other evenings in our Boston townhouse, the kind of place that had polished wood floors, large windows overlooking the Charles River, and a kitchen island that always seemed to collect unopened mail and half-finished glasses of wine. Daniel and I had bought the house 3 years earlier, paying nearly $1.6 million, a purchase we had told ourselves was a symbol of our success. Sterling Analytics, the consulting firm we had built together, had grown from late-night brainstorming sessions in a cramped apartment to a company worth several $1,000,000. On the surface, everything looked perfect. That night, I was seated at the island, hunched over my laptop and the stack of notes I had been refining for weeks. Tomorrow's pitch with the Hawthorne Group was everything. Their investment, a potential $50 million injection, would decide whether our expansion across New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles would remain a dream or become a reality. I had poured every ounce of strategy, analysis, and vision into the presentation. Daniel was supposed to be the face of it, the closer, the one who dazzled the room with his polished charm. I was sipping lukewarm coffee when Daniel's tablet lit up beside me. Normally, I never snooped. Our lives and work were so tangled that boundaries often blurred, but I respected his privacy. This time, the message was impossible to ignore. The screen glowed with Vanessa's name, the woman Daniel had once insisted was just a friendly rival, someone we could learn from. Against my better judgment, my eyes scanned the text. She'll fail tomorrow. Once she's gone, we'll take the firm and the marriage. My fingers went cold around the coffee mug. The words blurred, and for a moment I thought I was imagining them. But the message sat there, undeniable and cruel. In a few short sentences, my husband and business partner had managed to slice my world into pieces. He wasn't just planning to edge me out of the company I had built. He was also planning to discard me as his wife. I sat frozen in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. Every memory of the past 10 years replayed in my mind, each moment tainted by this betrayal. The nights we worked side by side, living on takeout and instant noodles, convincing ourselves we were building something bigger than both of us. The client dinners where he dazzled executives while I quietly slid him the strategy notes beneath the table. The vacations we never took because there was always another deal to chase. Everything felt like a lie now. I wanted to confront him right there, to demand an explanation, but something inside me told me not to. If Daniel and Vanessa thought I was blind, let them believe it a little longer. The element of surprise would become my shield. Later that evening, Daniel breezed into the kitchen, all effortless charm and feigned affection. He kissed the top of my head as though nothing had happened and started making coffee. His back was to me as he moved around the kitchen, and I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he poured something into one of the mugs. A faint dust, nearly invisible, swirled into the dark liquid. I froze again, this time not from shock but from clarity. He wasn't only planning to destroy me in the boardroom tomorrow. He was planning to sabotage me physically. Here, in our own kitchen. I watched silently, my mind whirling faster than ever before. He turned, sliding a mug across the counter toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Here you go, love. You've worked so hard, you deserve a little energy boost. My heart pounded as I lifted the mug, pretending not to notice. When he turned to grab something from the pantry, I switched our mugs with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. The faint powder he had poured for me now swirled in his drink. I looked down at mine, clean and safe, and forced a smile. Thanks, I said softly, hiding the storm that was gathering inside me. That night, while Daniel slept soundly in our master bedroom, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Rage, grief, and fear churned inside me, but above all, a sharp determination took root. They wanted me gone, erased, humiliated. Instead, I would let them destroy themselves. As the hours stretched into dawn, I thought about how easily I had trusted Daniel all these years. I remembered how proud we had been when Sterling Analytics landed its first $1 million contract, how I had worked through Christmas to design the predictive models that wowed investors. Daniel had been there, smiling for the photos, shaking hands with the clients, but it was always my work holding everything together. And now, the man who had once sworn he believed in me was conspiring to poison both my body and my future. I thought of Vanessa, too, the polished brunette with the sharp smile who always seemed too close for comfort. She had started as a competitor in New York, then somehow slid into our inner circle. She flattered Daniel, laughed at his jokes, praised his vision, and dismissed me as the woman who handled the details. The truth was, she had been circling for years, waiting for the chance to sink her claws into both my husband and my firm. At some point in the night, I rose from bed and walked quietly to the study. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the city lights outside the windows. I opened Daniel's tablet again, scrolling through his messages with Vanessa. Each line was a dagger. They had mapped out everything: how she would step into my place at Sterling Analytics, how they would present themselves as the dynamic power couple to the Hawthorne Group, how my supposed failure tomorrow would be the proof investors needed to push me aside. But what they hadn't counted on was me. I sat at the desk, flipping open my notebook filled with diagrams, projections, and market analyses. My presentation was flawless, down to the smallest detail. If tomorrow went as I planned, it wouldn't just be a victory for Sterling Analytics. It would be my personal vindication. The investors would see through Daniel's weakness and Vanessa's manipulation. They would see me. By the time the first light of morning crept through the curtains, my path was clear. I had been betrayed, but I would not be broken. Daniel thought he could drug me into silence, strip me of my company, and hand my life's work to another woman. Instead, he had given me the gift of certainty. Now I knew exactly who he was and exactly what I had to do. When Daniel stirred awake a few hours later, groggy and pale, I was already dressed for the day. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer in the mirror, steadying my breathing. My reflection looked calmer than I felt, but the steel in my eyes was undeniable. "Big day," he mumbled, rubbing his temples. "Yes," I replied, my voice even. "The biggest." As I walked out the door with my portfolio in hand, I knew my life had split in two. There was the woman who had once believed in love, trust, and partnership. And then there was the woman I had become overnight, someone who would never again let betrayal catch her off guard. Tomorrow, in that boardroom, everything would change. The morning of the pitch dawned gray and heavy, as though the city itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Boston was quiet outside my townhouse windows, the Charles River moving lazily under a layer of mist. I slipped into my navy blazer, smoothed my hair, and stared at my reflection one last time. My face looked calm, but beneath the surface, a storm churned. Daniel emerged from the bedroom pale, his eyes ringed with shadows. He blamed it on a poor night's sleep, but I knew the truth. The powder he had slipped into my coffee now rested in his bloodstream. He winced as he buttoned his shirt, his hands trembling slightly. I forced a smile and handed him his briefcase, pretending to be the supportive wife I no longer was. Inside, I felt like a soldier preparing for battle. We arrived at the Hawthorne Tower just before 9. The building rose like a monument to power, glass, steel, and marble polished to an intimidating shine. Inside the lobby, I could hear the echo of our heels on the polished floor, each step amplifying the tension between us. Daniel tried to steady himself, greeting the receptionist with his usual charm, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. I stayed silent, watching him unravel one thread at a time. The boardroom was everything you would expect of a firm preparing to commit $50 million. A long mahogany table stretched across the center, surrounded by leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, and the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive cologne. 11 investors sat waiting, men and women with portfolios that could shift the direction of entire industries. Their suits were tailored, their watches gleamed, and their expressions were expectant. Daniel began the meeting as planned, striding to the front of the room with his usual swagger. But the cracks showed immediately. His face was flushed, his collar damp with sweat. He shuffled his notes like a nervous intern instead of the polished executive he pretended to be. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slurred, "thank you for being here. Sterling Analytics. Is proud to..." His words faltered, dissolving into a stammer. A hush fell over the room. The investors exchanged glances, their sharp eyes narrowing. This was not the confident man they had expected. One of them, a silver-haired chairman named Mr. Hawthorne himself, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Daniel tried again, but his tongue betrayed him. His hands shook so violently that his notes scattered across the floor. As he bent to pick them up, he nearly toppled over, grabbing the edge of the table to steady himself. A ripple of discomfort spread around the room. My heart pounded, but not from fear. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to reclaim everything that was mine. I rose slowly, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I walked to the front of the room. Every eye shifted from Daniel's humiliation to me. I felt the weight of their stares, but instead of shrinking under it, I stood taller. "Allow me," I said, my voice steady, clear, and controlled. I gathered the fallen notes, placed them neatly on the table, and turned to the investors with the kind of confidence I had been cultivating for a decade. For the next 2 hours, I owned that room. I walked them through the expansion strategy Daniel had mocked me for obsessing over. Using crisp slides and precise data, I painted the vision of Sterling Analytics not as a struggling firm, but as a powerhouse positioned to dominate the American market. I spoke of Boston, New York, and Chicago as our immediate targets, 3 cities that could generate projected returns of $120 million within 3 years. I introduced the idea of building transatlantic partnerships, securing a foothold in London's financial district, and leveraging relationships in Europe to give our clients unrivaled insight. I presented numbers, charts, and models that reflected months of sleepless nights at my kitchen desk. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't waver. With every sentence, I felt their interest sharpen, their skepticism dissolve into respect. Daniel sat slumped at the far end of the table, his complexion ashen, his tie loosened in defeat. He tried once or twice to interject, but his words slurred into nonsense, and the investors ignored him. All their focus was on me. At one point, a woman named Charlotte, head of the investment committee, leaned forward. "How do you plan to scale so quickly?" she asked. I smiled, prepared for the question. "We've already established pilot programs in Boston, which have outperformed our forecasts by nearly 12%. By replicating those systems in New York and Chicago, while leveraging local expertise, we can accelerate results. Additionally, our predictive models, designed in-house, are more accurate than any competitor currently in the market. Investors won't just be backing growth. They'll be backing certainty." I could see the flicker of approval in her eyes. Around the table, pens scribbled notes. Heads nodded. The tide had turned. By the time I concluded, the silence in the room was no longer uncomfortable. It was charged, brimming with energy. I let the pause hang for a moment, then folded my hands and said simply, "Gentlemen, ladies, the future of Sterling Analytics is secure. All it needs now is the right partners to bring it to scale." Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat, leaned forward, and steepled his fingers. "Miss Sterling," he said, deliberately ignoring Daniel, "we'll sign with you directly." The words hit me like a thunderclap. Relief surged through me, but so did something sharper: vindication. I had been doubted, dismissed, and betrayed. Yet here I was, standing tall, chosen, trusted. My heart raced, but my face remained composed as I nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. You won't regret it." Across the table, Daniel sat hollow-eyed, his credibility shattered before the very people he had hoped to impress. No one looked at him now. No one asked for his opinion. The man who had once basked in the glow of my work was now a shadow, exposed and irrelevant. When the meeting ended, handshakes were exchanged, contracts discussed, and promises made. Investors clasped my hand firmly, their smiles genuine, their voices filled with confidence. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of my own power. As we left the building, Daniel stumbled beside me, his silence deafening. He tried to mumble something about being unwell, but I didn't respond. I no longer owed him reassurance or comfort. Instead, I focused on the rhythm of my heels striking the marble floor, each step a reminder that I had survived his betrayal and turned it into my greatest triumph. Outside, the city was alive with midday traffic, horns blaring, pedestrians rushing past with their lattes and briefcases. But for me, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The deal was mine, the future was mine, and the man who thought he could poison me into failure had poisoned only himself. That night, as I sat alone in the study of our Boston townhouse, I replayed every moment of the pitch. The silence when Daniel faltered, the way the investors leaned in when I spoke, and the final words of Mr. Hawthorne sealed my victory. I savored it like the finest wine, not because I wanted revenge, though the taste of it was sweet, but because it proved what I had always known deep down. I was the strategist, the leader, the one with vision. Daniel had only ever been the mask, and now the mask had slipped. Tomorrow would bring questions, consequences, and perhaps battles I had not yet foreseen. But tonight I allowed myself to feel it fully. the turning point. My life had shifted in that boardroom, and nothing would ever be the same again. When the adrenaline from the Hawthorne pitch finally faded, reality set in. Winning the deal was only the beginning. Daniel's betrayal wasn't limited to that one poisoned cup of coffee or his humiliating performance in the boardroom. No, his treachery ran deeper, and I knew instinctively that the presentation had only scratched the surface. If I wanted to secure my future and protect everything I had built, I would need proof. Solid, undeniable proof that would hold up in a courtroom as well as a boardroom. Back at our Boston townhouse, I began the quiet work of untangling lies. It was both exhausting and strangely invigorating. Each evening, when Daniel passed out early from his own guilt and stress, I slipped into the study with his tablet, his phone, and a growing determination. My hands shook the first time I scrolled through his emails, but the nerves soon gave way to icy focus. It didn't take long to uncover the evidence I feared and expected. There were emails with Vanessa, their language dripping with arrogance and entitlement. They spoke not just of replacing me at Sterling Analytics, but of siphoning money into a private account in New York. I stared at the numbers on the screen, rage rising in my chest. Tens of thousands of dollars at first, then hundreds of thousands. All funds that had been redirected without my knowledge were funneled away from our accounts into theirs. He had been bleeding the company dry while standing beside me in boardrooms and smiling for holiday photos. I began printing everything: emails, spreadsheets, contracts. I hid the documents in a locked drawer beneath the false bottom of my desk. I learned quickly to keep my expression neutral around Daniel, even when I had just discovered another damning transfer or fraudulent signature. It was almost laughable how carelessly he had tried to cover his tracks, as if he truly believed I would never question him. But this was bigger than what I could handle alone. One evening, while Daniel was out meeting with clients I knew were nothing more than excuses to see Vanessa, I picked up the phone and made a call to Washington, D.C. months earlier. I had read about an attorney named Margaret Keene, a woman known for dismantling corporate fraud schemes with surgical precision. She had represented Fortune 500 companies, exposed embezzlement rings, and never lost a major case. If anyone could help me, it was her. When she answered, her voice was crisp and businesslike. I explained my situation in broad strokes, careful not to let my emotions spill over. There was a long pause on the other end before she said, "Send me what you have. If it's as bad as you think, we'll build a case strong enough to strip him of everything." The next day, I wired her $45,000 as a retainer. It felt like a staggering sum, but compared to what was at stake, the company, my reputation, my independence, it was a bargain. Margaret flew to Boston the following week, and when we met in a quiet cafe downtown, I laid out the thick folder of documents I had collected. She flipped through the pages with sharp eyes, her pen scratching notes in the margins. "This is more than enough to begin," she said finally. "He signed contracts without your consent. That's corporate fraud. These transfers are embezzlement. The collusion with Vanessa shows intent. With the right filings, we can freeze all company assets under your name until the court sorts it out." For the first time since discovering Daniel's betrayal, I felt hope. Not just the fragile hope of surviving day to day, but the solid kind that came from knowing the law could be a weapon in my hands. The weeks that followed were a blur of strategy and secrecy. Margaret and her team drafted motions, subpoenas, and emergency orders. Every time Daniel left the house, I met with her in quiet offices or communicated through encrypted emails. It felt like living a double life, but unlike Daniel's deception, mine was built on truth. The more we uncovered, the worse it became. Vanessa had been funneling her own clients' payments through Sterling Analytics, skimming percentages into her pocket while Daniel looked the other way. She had even used our company credit line to fund a personal real estate purchase in Connecticut, a $1.2 million house she had intended to share with Daniel once I was out of the picture. The audacity of it made me laugh bitterly in the dark hours of the night. Eventually, Margaret filed the emergency petition in federal court. I will never forget the moment she called me with the update. "The judge signed the order," she said, her tone brisk but triumphant. "All assets are frozen under your name pending investigation. He can't touch the accounts, can't sell property, can't make a move without your signature." When I hung up, I felt tears prick my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of release. For months, perhaps even years, I had been carrying the silent weight of suspicion, frustration, and betrayal. Now the balance of power had shifted. Daniel, of course, noticed almost immediately. The next morning, when he tried to wire funds for business expenses, the system rejected the transaction. His face drained of color as he stared at the screen. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. I shrugged, stirring cream into my coffee. "Maybe the bank flagged it. You should ask them." His eyes searched mine, but I gave him nothing. He muttered curses under his breath and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. I sat there in silence, savoring the moment. A week later, he received the official summons. I was upstairs when I heard the sound of the envelope tearing open, followed by a string of angry shouts. He barged into the bedroom, the papers crumpled in his fists. "You did this," he hissed, his face twisted with fury. I looked at him calmly, my voice steady. "No, Daniel. You did this." For once, he had no clever retort. He tried to beg later, to spin tales of misunderstanding and desperation, but his words held no power anymore. I had seen the receipts, the signatures, the messages. He had gambled with my life's work, and the only thing left for him was the ruin he had created. As the legal proceedings rolled forward, Vanessa's world began to collapse, too. Her consulting license was suspended pending investigation, her clients fled, and whispers of fraud circulated through every corporate circle in New York. I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the smug tone in her emails. The way she had written "she'll fail tomorrow" with such certainty. Now it was her name being whispered in boardrooms, not as a rising star but as a cautionary tale. Through it all, I kept building. While the courts untangled the fraud, I doubled down on my work. I took meetings alone, signed contracts myself, and began to shape Sterling Analytics into the company I had always envisioned. Investors respected me more than ever, not just for my intellect, but for my resilience. Every night, I filed another stack of documents into my locked drawer, each page a reminder of how far I had come. The woman who had once been dismissed as the behind-the-scenes strategist was now the undeniable force at the center of it all. Daniel and Vanessa had underestimated me, but their betrayal had only sharpened my resolve. By the end of that year, Daniel stood on the edge of financial ruin. Vanessa's reputation was in ashes, and I was stronger than I had ever been. The case wasn't finished yet, but the outcome was already clear. I had taken back control of my company, my future, and myself. And as I sat in my study one evening, sipping a glass of wine and looking out over the glittering Boston skyline, I realized something profound. Betrayal had nearly broken me, but in the end, it had forged me instead. I was no longer the woman who built quietly in the shadows. I was the woman who fought, who gathered evidence, who stood her ground, and I wasn't done yet. By the end of that year, my world looked nothing like the one Daniel and Vanessa had imagined for me. Sterling Analytics belonged fully to me, my name inked alone on the legal documents that had once borne both our signatures. Daniel's shares were seized to cover the fraud he had committed, leaving him stripped of the company he thought he could steal. Vanessa, once so smug and ambitious, declared bankruptcy after her clients fled in droves. The empire they had plotted to build together turned to dust, while mine began to rise stronger than ever. It was not easy. Those first months after the court's decision were grueling. I was running the firm almost single-handedly, juggling investor meetings, new contracts, and the day-to-day chaos of an expanding operation. Yet despite the exhaustion, I had never felt more alive. Each handshake, each signature, each deal inked reminded me that I had survived betrayal and come out the other side sharpened, unbreakable. The Hawthorne investment was the first domino. Word spread quickly through Boston, New York, and Chicago that Sterling Analytics had secured $50 million to fuel its expansion. With Hawthorne's stamp of approval, doors that had once been closed to me swung wide open. Within months, I was negotiating contracts with firms in Manhattan worth $20 million annually, advising Chicago manufacturing giants, and even consulting for government projects in Washington. The reputation that had once been shared between Daniel and me was now mine alone, and it carried more weight than I had ever dreamed. By the following summer, I knew it was time to take Sterling Analytics beyond the East Coast. I opened a sleek office in Los Angeles, a city buzzing with tech startups desperate for data-driven strategies. That office alone generated $35 million in new revenue in its first year, a figure that still makes me smile when I think about it. Houston followed, where we signed a $12 million contract with an oil logistics firm that had been floundering until my team streamlined its operations. Each new office was proof that my vision was right all along. And then came London. For years, I had whispered about the possibility of bridging America and Europe, of creating a consulting network that spanned continents. Daniel had always dismissed it as unrealistic, too costly, too risky. But I wasn't afraid of risk anymore. With our U.S. operations thriving, I flew to London and negotiated personally with partners in the financial district. I remember standing in a boardroom overlooking the Thames, the city's gray skyline stretching out beyond the glass, and telling a group of skeptical British investors, Sterling Analytics is not just a company, it's a movement. By the end of the week, I had secured a satellite branch, my first foothold in Europe. Within 2 years of Daniel's downfall, Sterling Analytics revenue had doubled to $200 million. What once had been a scrappy firm born in a cramped apartment was now a multinational enterprise with hundreds of employees and clients spanning 2 continents. Investors who once wouldn't take my calls now sent invitations daily, begging me to sit at their tables. I had become not just a strategist, but a force. Success changed my personal life, too. I no longer lived in the Boston townhouse haunted by memories of betrayal. Instead, I purchased a Georgian-style estate just outside the city for $6.8 million, paying in cash. The house had sweeping staircases, sprawling gardens, and a library that became my sanctuary. In that library, I placed every contract I had ever signed, bound neatly in leather folders and arranged along mahogany shelves. At night, I would sit there with a glass of red wine, running my fingers along the spines, remembering how close I had come to losing it all. Those documents weren't just legal papers. They were the story of my survival. People often ask about Daniel. They wanted to know how someone who had stood at my side for a decade could fall so far, so fast. Some asked with sympathy, others with curiosity. I never gave them details. Instead, I smiled and said simply, "Some partnerships are meant to end." It was all the answer they needed. He had tried to erase me, and instead, he had erased himself. Occasionally, I would hear whispers about him. He was living in a small apartment in Connecticut, struggling to pay bills. That he had tried unsuccessfully to launch another consulting venture, only to be laughed out of boardrooms when his reputation caught up with him. Vanessa had long since disappeared from the professional world, her name a stain on corporate circles. I didn't waste energy on either of them. They had written themselves out of my story the moment they conspired against me. My focus was on building, not just an empire, but a legacy. I began mentoring young women in business, women who reminded me of myself in those early years when no one believed in me. I told them the truth, that brilliance without resilience is fragile, but resilience sharpened by betrayal can move mountains. Some of them would sit in my office in tears, overwhelmed by the challenges of proving themselves. I would hand them a contract from my library and say, "Read this." Every line represents someone who underestimated me, and every line proves why I'm still here. The empire I built was not just about money, though the wealth gave me freedom I had never known. It was about control, independence, and the knowledge that no one could ever take it from me again. I no longer needed anyone to validate me or stand beside me as a shield. I was my own shield. Sometimes late at night, I would walk through the grand halls of my estate, the silence echoing with possibility. The chandeliers glittered overhead, the gardens glowed softly in the moonlight, and I would think back to that kitchen night when Daniel slipped powder into my coffee, convinced he had sealed my fate. He had thought I was weak. He had thought I was blind. But he had forgotten one thing. I was always the strategist. What was meant to be my downfall became the foundation of my empire, and that, more than anything, is my story.